The western horizon blazed crimson as the sun dipped below the endless prairie, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. In this unforgiving wilderness, where the line between life and death was as thin as morning frost, stories of resilience were carved into the very soil. This is one such tale, a journey of unspeakable loss, unexpected connection, and the remarkable power of the human spirit to find healing in the most unlikely places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When 26-year-old Eleanor Mason watched her entire world burn before her eyes, she became something both more and less than human, a ghost among the living, haunting the plains like a restless spirit. For years, settlers spoke of the wild-eyed woman who appeared and vanished like prairie smoke, a phantom born of tragedy. What they didn't know was that Eleanor's journey from broken to whole would challenge the very foundations of two worlds and redefine the meaning of healing itself. Spring of 1873 had promised new beginnings for Eleanor Mason. At 26, she embodied the perfect blend of Eastern refinement and frontier determination. With bright eyes that reflected an insatiable curiosity and hands equally capable of transcribing Latin poetry or building a serviceable fence, Eleanor had earned respect as the schoolteacher in the burgeoning settlement of Clearwater Creek. Her classroom, a modest structure of rough-hewn timber with carefully placed windows to capture the maximum natural light, had become the pride of the small community. For 3 years, she had nurtured the minds of frontier children, introducing them to worlds beyond the vast prairie that surrounded their isolated existence. Eleanor believed fiercely in the power of education to elevate the human spirit, a philosophy she had carried westward from her Massachusetts upbringing like a precious heirloom. The wilderness sharpens the body, but knowledge illuminates the soul, she often told her students, a collection of weather-worn farm children whose calloused hands belied their youth. On this particular morning, as meadowlarks announced the dawn, with persistent optimism, Eleanor stood before her small mirror, pinning the last stubborn strands of chestnut hair into a practical bun. Her husband Michael, already awake for hours, tending to their modest homestead, appeared in the doorway with a cup of steaming coffee. "The Beckett family headed to Fort Sullivan today," he said, handing her the simple tin cup. "Thomas asked if we might join their wagon. Says the trail's safer with more guns." Eleanor sipped the bitter brew, considering. Fort Sullivan lay 4 days' journey west, a trading post that offered supplies unavailable in Clearwater Creek. They had postponed the trip through the harsh winter, but their stores were dwindling, particularly the medicines Eleanor used to treat the community's various ailments, a skill she had developed out of necessity when the settlement's only doctor succumbed to pneumonia the previous winter. "The school term ends tomorrow," she replied. "We could leave the day after. The children would appreciate having their spelling tests graded before I disappear into the wilderness." Michael's weather-lined face softened with affection. "Always the devoted teacher," he said, brushing stray hair from her forehead. "I'll tell Thomas we'll meet them at dawn on Thursday." Neither could have known that this simple decision would forever alter the course of Eleanor's life, that within a week, everything and everyone she cherished would be stripped away, leaving behind only the hollow shell of the woman who once was. The journey began uneventfully. 3 wagons, 17 souls in total. The Becketts with their 4 children, the Williams family, Henry, his pregnant wife Sarah, and their elderly father, and Eleanor and Michael, childless not by choice, but by cruel circumstance, though. They still harbored quiet hopes. The early summer prairie stretched before them, a vast sea of green, rippling in the constant wind. Eleanor documented the journey in her journal each evening, noting the varieties of wildflowers, the changing soil compositions, the magnificent storms that rolled across the open sky like divine theatre. On the third day, they made camp beside a shallow creek bordered by one of the few stands of cottonwood trees in the otherwise exposed landscape. The evening passed pleasantly with shared food, stories, and the simple camaraderie of frontier families. Eleanor read aloud from The Odyssey, translating Homer's ancient words into a tale the children could understand. Wanderers far from home, facing unknown dangers, yet driven by the fundamental human desire to return to what they loved. No one noticed the watching eyes. Dawn brought death with terrifying swiftness. Eleanor woke to screams and the crack of gunfire. Michael thrust her beneath the wagon, pressing his rifle into her hands with a desperate command, "Stay hidden!" before grabbing his pistol and rushing toward the sounds of chaos. Through the narrow space between ground and wagon bed, Eleanor witnessed fragmented horrors. Thomas Beckett falling with 3 arrows protruding from his chest. Sarah Williams dragged by her hair, her pregnant belly vulnerable to the morning. Son, children running in blind panic. The attack was not prolonged, precise, methodical, devastating. When silence finally fell, Eleanor remained frozen beneath the wagon, the rifle clutched in bloodless fingers, her breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the dust beneath her cheek. Smoke stung her nostrils. The wagons had been set ablaze. The heat intensified, forcing her to roll deeper under the wagon's center. As flames consumed their modest possessions, a terrible understanding dawned. She had not fired a single shot. Not one. Terror had rendered her immobile when action might have saved at least one life. This knowledge would haunt her far longer than any physical wound. As the attacking party departed with stolen horses and supplies, Eleanor remained concealed, listening to the crackle of flames consuming everything. She had known. Only when the sun had climbed high in the sky did she dare emerge, crawling on dust-coated hands and knees into a world transformed by violence. The scene defied comprehension. Bodies lay strewn across what had been their peaceful camp, some partially burned, others mutilated in ways her mind refused to process fully. Eleanor moved among them with mechanical detachment, a strange calm descending like a protective veil between her consciousness and the horror surrounding her. She found Michael near the Williams wagon, his body curled protectively around their youngest child, Emily. Neither had survived. Something essential fractured within Eleanor in that moment. Not a clean break that might eventually heal, but a splintering so profound that the pieces could never again fit together as they once had. Yet her body continued its autonomous functions. She breathed, her heart beat. Her hands, operating on some primal instinct separate from conscious thought, began the impossible task of burying the dead. For 2 days, Eleanor dug shallow graves in the unyielding prairie soil using a broken wagon board, her hands blistering, then bleeding as the makeshift tool wore through skin. She did not cry. She did not speak. The methodical labor became a ritual that kept madness at bay, though anyone observing might have already judged her lost to reason. With the last body laid to rest, Eleanor gathered what meager supplies had survived the flames. A canteen, a small knife, Michael's charred Bible, and her own journal, which had been in her apron pocket during the attack. With no clear destination in mind, she began walking eastward, toward the direction of home, though home no longer held any meaning. Days blurred together. Eleanor moved like an automaton, stopping only when her body refused to continue, eating what she could scavenge. Prairie turnips dug from the ground, eggs stolen from unattended nests, occasionally small game caught through sheer persistence rather than skill. The journal became both confidant and anchor to sanity. In its pages, Eleanor documented not just her physical journey, but the strange detachment that had overtaken her spirit. "I have become a vessel, emptied of everything but breath," she wrote by moonlight. "Not alive, yet unable to die. Perhaps this is God's cruelest punishment, to make me the witness who must carry this story when all others have been released from earthly suffering. Weeks passed. Eleanor's appearance transformed. Her once neat clothing hung in tatters, her skin darkened and weathered under the relentless sun. Her hair, fallen from its pins, grew wild and tangled. When she encountered the occasional settler or trapper, she hid from view, watching with the wariness of a hunted animal. In rare instances, when contact proved unavoidable, her behavior was so erratic, her speech so disjointed, that tales began to spread of a ghost woman wandering the plains, perhaps the spirit of a pioneer who had died in transit, unable to rest until she reached her intended destination. By autumn, Eleanor had developed survival instincts that would have astonished her former self. She could read weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, find water in seemingly barren landscapes, and move with such stealth that even wildlife remained unaware of her presence until she was upon them. Yet these skills served only her physical survival. Emotionally and spiritually, she remained adrift, a fragment of humanity severed from the connections that give life meaning. When winter descended, Eleanor found shelter in an abandoned sod house, half collapsed, but still offering protection from the merciless prairie wind. She existed there in a state of semi-hibernation, venturing out only to collect water or hunt for sustenance, spending long hours staring at the rough-hewn walls or writing increasingly abstract entries in her journal, sometimes coherent reflections, other times merely words arranged in patterns comprehensible only to her fractured mind. Spring arrived, then summer, autumn again, another winter. The rhythm of seasons continued while Eleanor existed in a liminal space between living and merely persisting. She began avoiding her reflection in still water, unable to reconcile the wild creature she glimpsed with the educated, purposeful woman she once had been. The rare settlers who spotted her spread stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. She was a banshee who foretold death, a witch who communed with spirits, a madwoman who cursed anyone who showed her kindness. In truth, she was simply broken, carrying wounds too deep for conventional healing. By the third year, Eleanor had carved out a nomadic existence across the territory, never staying in one location long enough to form connections. Her ability to disappear became almost supernatural, here one moment, gone the next, leaving only disturbed grass as evidence of her passing. The journal, now filled with a language uniquely her own, served as the sole repository of her diminishing humanity. On rare occasions, moments of clarity would pierce the protective fog that shrouded her mind. During these intervals, the full weight of her loss and isolation would crash upon her with such force that Eleanor would find herself curled upon the ground, finally releasing anguished sounds that scarcely resembled human crying. These episodes inevitably ended with her retreating further into the wilderness, fleeing not just from others, but from the parts of herself that still remembered the connection. The settlers along the expanding frontier came to view her with a mixture of fear and superstitious reverence. Children were warned not to wander too far from homesteads, lest the prairie ghost steal them away. Adults made signs to ward off evil when discussing sightings of the wild woman. Few recognized the profound tragedy walking among them, a soul neither fully present in the world of the living, nor released to whatever peace might await beyond. This existence might have continued indefinitely, Eleanor gradually fading into prairie mythology, her true story lost beneath layers of frontier superstition. But the universe, in its mysterious workings, sometimes creates intersections, where broken paths have opportunity to be remade, moments where healing becomes possible, not despite differences, but because of them. And so it was that in the fourth year of her solitary wandering, as an early autumn storm painted threatening patterns across the western sky, Eleanor Mason's path would cross with someone uniquely qualified to recognize that beneath her fearsome appearance dwelled not a ghost, not a witch, but simply a woman carrying wounds no ordinary medicine could touch. Autumn painted the prairie, in subdued golds and ambers as the fourth year of Eleanor's solitary existence began. The first frost had arrived early, silvering the tall grasses each morning before retreating under the still warm midday sun. This transitional season stirred a restlessness in Eleanor that she couldn't name, a visceral understanding shared by all prairie creatures that harsher times approached. Demanding preparation and decision, Eleanor had developed an intricate mental map of the territory, categorizing areas by their safety, resource availability, and human activity. Her wanderings were not entirely random, but followed patterns only. She could discern, guided by a feral instinct that had replaced her once methodical reasoning. Her current path led southeast toward a secluded valley where she had wintered once before, a place with a small cave, reliable game trails, and minimal evidence of settler encroachment. The weather, however, had other plans. Dark clouds gathered, with alarming speed one afternoon, transforming the gentle breeze into a knife-edged wind that carried the unmistakable scent of imminent snow. Too early, Eleanor thought, her first coherent observation in days. The sudden shift reminded her of the freak storm that had claimed 3 of her students during her first year at Clearwater Creek. Children who had wandered too far during a seemingly mild autumn day, only to be found frozen by morning, huddled together like fallen birds. This memory, sharp, unwelcome, yet undeniably hers, momentarily pierced the protective fog that typically shrouded her mind. Eleanor stood paralyzed between past and present as the first heavy snowflakes began their silent descent. Shelter. She needed shelter immediately. The nearest option lay westward, an abandoned homestead she had explored earlier that year. Its previous occupants had left suddenly, evidenced by the half-prepared meal she discovered petrified on their crude table. The dwelling remained partially intact, its sod walls providing better protection than anything she could construct in the rapidly deteriorating conditions. Eleanor moved with purpose now, her tattered dress whipping around thin legs as the wind intensified. The snowfall thickened, obscuring visibility beyond a few yards and quickly transforming the familiar landscape into an alien terrain of indistinct shapes and treacherous footing. The temperature plummeted with alarming speed. 2 hours into her desperate journey, Eleanor realized she had miscalculated. Disorientation, that most dangerous of wilderness threats, had led her astray. Nothing in the white expanse surrounding her appeared familiar. The rational fragment of her mind, the school teacher who had once lectured on survival tactics gleaned from books, whispered that continuing blindly would only hasten her demise. Yet stopping meant certain death as night approached with its killing cold. Eleanor forged ahead, each step requiring greater effort as snow accumulated above her ankles. Her extremities grew numb, then painful, then numb again. The progression of freezing she recognized with academic detachment. The wind's howl became a physical force, pushing against her with malevolent determination. Twice she fell to her knees, each time requiring longer to regain her footing. As daylight faded, leaving only the eerie luminescence of snow-reflected dusk, Eleanor confronted the possibility that her strange half-existence would end here, anonymously, in this nameless stretch of prairie. Perhaps this was fitting, to disappear as completely in death as she had in life. She had survived one impossible scenario only to succumb to another, more mundane yet equally lethal threat. The thought brought unexpected peace. Eleanor's steps slowed, then halted. She sank to her knees in the deepening snow, a curious warmth spreading through her despite the killing cold. Her journal, her constant companion, clutched against her chest, ensuring that even if her body was eventually discovered, something of her story might survive. Through swirling snow, Eleanor thought she glimpsed movement, perhaps a deer or wolf drawn by the scent of imminent death. She lacked the energy to feel fear. Instead, she watched with detached curiosity as the indistinct form grew larger, more deliberate in its approach. Not animal, but human. A figure wrapped in furs, moving with surprising ease through the treacherous conditions. Eleanor's first instinct to flee from human contact couldn't overcome her physical inability to move. She remained kneeling, swaying slightly as consciousness flickered. The figure paused several yards away, assessing her with evident caution. Through snow-crusted lashes, Eleanor discerned a man's silhouette, tall and broad-shouldered, his features obscured by both the storm and the fur-lined hood that protected his face. He spoke words carried away by the howling wind before reaching her ears. When she made no response, he approached slowly, hands extended slightly in what might have been a gesture of peace. Eleanor felt consciousness slipping, darkness encroaching at the edges of her vision. The last sensation she registered was being lifted from the snow with surprising gentleness, cradled against warmth that seemed impossible in this frozen landscape. Then, nothing. Awareness returned gradually, sensations arriving disconnected from understanding. Warmth, the crackling of fire, the scent of herbs and smoke. Eleanor's body felt impossibly heavy, yet simultaneously unmoored, as though she might float away from herself without the weight of furs pressing her against an unfamiliar surface. When she finally managed to open her eyes, the world appeared. As a blur of earthen tones and dancing shadows. "You return." The deep voice startled her fully awake. Eleanor's gaze darted frantically around what she now recognized as some kind of dwelling, not a settler's cabin, but a structure unlike any she'd encountered. Circular, with walls that curved upward to a central opening where daylight and occasional snowflakes entered. Various items hung from the supporting framework, bundles of dried plants, animal skins, tools crafted from bone and stone. The man who had spoken sat cross-legged near a central fire pit, watching her with unnerving steadiness. His features reflected native heritage. High cheekbones, copper skin, and straight black hair that fell past his shoulders. He appeared to be perhaps 40 years of age, though something in his dark eyes suggested greater wisdom than even those years might account for. Eleanor's instinct for flight surged through her weakened body. She struggled to rise, only to fall back as dizziness overwhelmed her. "The storm has not finished its anger," the man said, his English accented but clear. 3 days now it rages. The snow spirit tries to claim you, but your body refuses its invitation. 3 days. Eleanor had lost 3 days to unconsciousness. Her hand moved automatically to her side, seeking her journal, her anchor to self. It was gone. Panic constricted her throat. Noting her distress, the man reached beside him and lifted her weather-worn journal. "This speaks without sound," he said, holding it toward her but not approaching. "You protect it even as the cold takes your thoughts." Eleanor stared at the offered journal, then at the man, caught between desperate desire for her most precious possession and fear of proximity to another human being. After a long moment, she extended a trembling hand. He placed the journal in her palm without making contact, respecting the invisible boundary surrounding her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I am called Daniel Rivers among your people," he said as she clutched the journal to her chest. "My Pawnee name has a different meaning, not easily shaped by the English tongue." Eleanor made no response, her voice atrophied from years of disuse. Daniel seemed untroubled by her silence, turning his attention to a clay pot nestled in the fire's embers. He stirred its contents with a wooden utensil before filling a small bowl with steaming liquid. "This will bring warmth back to your center," he said, placing the bowl halfway between them, close enough for her to reach, far enough to maintain her essential distance. When body grows strong again, spirit may find its voice. The rich aroma of the broth weakened Eleanor's instinctive suspicion. How long since she had eaten anything properly prepared? She couldn't remember. With halting movements, she reached for the bowl, drawing it quickly to herself before retreating back against the furs. The first sip spread warmth through her chest, the flavor complex and unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. Daniel busied himself with various tasks, adding wood to the fire, sorting through bundles of dried plants, occasionally checking outside, through the dwelling's entrance flap, all while maintaining a respectful distance. His movements held a deliberate quality, each action flowing purposefully into the next with minimal wasted energy. Despite her wariness, Eleanor found herself drawn to this quiet efficiency. As daylight faded, replaced by the amber glow of firelight, Daniel began preparing a more substantial meal. He worked without explanation or apparent expectation of assistance, yet the occasional glance in Eleanor's direction suggested awareness of her observing every movement with wary attention. "The snow continues," he commented, breaking the extended silence, "but its anger lessens. Tomorrow perhaps it rests." Eleanor remained silent, though she had begun forming responses in her mind. Partial sentences, fragments of thoughts that didn't quite translate into speech. When Daniel offered a portion of the evening meal, some kind of stew with tender meat and unfamiliar roots, she accepted with slightly less hesitation than before. The nourishment sent waves of exhaustion through her body, the safety of the warm shelter overriding her customary vigilance. "Sleep brings healing," Daniel observed, noting her struggle to remain alert. "The spirits guard this place. No harm finds you here." Despite her deeply ingrained distrust, Eleanor found herself surrendering to overwhelming fatigue. Her last impression before sleep claimed her was of Daniel adding wood to the fire, his profile silhouetted against the flames, embodying a steadfast presence that stood between her vulnerability and the howling wilderness beyond. Morning arrived with muted light filtering through the smoke hole, indicating the storm had indeed diminished, though not entirely passed. Eleanor woke fully alert, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Daniel was absent, though evidence of his recent presence remained. The banked fire still provided gentle warmth, and a small wooden cup of what appeared to be tea stood within her reach. Eleanor's body protested as she sat upright, muscles stiff from prolonged inactivity. The tea, flavored with mint and something sweetly unfamiliar, helped clear the fog from her mind. For the first time in years, she took deliberate stock of her situation with something approaching her former analytical clarity. The dwelling, she now recognized it as a traditional earth lodge, showed signs of both permanent habitation and recent construction. Various containers of food stores lined one section of the circular space, while medicinal plants hung from the framework above. Tools for hunting, food preparation, and what appeared to be ceremonial objects occupied designated areas with meticulous organization. Everything spoke of careful preparation and deep knowledge of survival requirements. Eleanor's exploration was interrupted by Daniel's return. He entered carrying an armload of firewood, his movements pausing briefly when he noticed her awakened state before continuing his task with characteristic deliberation. "The snow rests," he announced, arranging the wood beside the central fire pit, "but more will come before night returns." Eleanor watched him, questions forming in her mind that still refused translation to her lips. When he had finished with the firewood, Daniel settled across the fire from her, not quite meeting her gaze, a deliberate tactic, she realized, to avoid appearing threatening. "You walked the prairie for many seasons," he said, not a question but an observation. "Alone, avoiding the places where smoke rises from settler dwellings." Eleanor stiffened, unsure how he could know this, but unable to deny its accuracy. "Twice. Before I saw your path cross distant hills, Daniel continued, the settlers speak of a ghost woman. They do not understand what I see, not ghosts, but wounded spirits, not madness, but pain too great for one body to carry. His perception, spoken, without judgment or pity, struck Eleanor with the force of physical contact. Tears formed unbidden, the first she had shed since those initial days of mechanical grave-digging years before. She blinked rapidly, turning away from his perceptive gaze. "Your dwelling," she managed finally, her voice a harsh croak, barely recognizable, as speech, far from others. Daniel's expression revealed momentary surprise at her broken silence, quickly replaced by measured acknowledgement. "My people camp 3 days' journey south for winter. I keep a separate lodge here, where certain plants grow that heal wounds others cannot see." Eleanor processed this information, her mind working with increasing clarity. "You're a healer." "Among my people, I am called Medicine Man," he confirmed. But not as white settlers understand this role. I tend to sickness of spirit as much as flesh." The implication hung between them, unaddressed, yet unmistakable. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her journal, her most concrete connection to self. "I don't seek healing," she stated flatly, surprising herself with the firmness in her ravaged voice. Daniel studied the fire, adding a small branch before responding. "The wounded deer does not seek the hunter's arrow to end its suffering. Yet sometimes paths cross when neither intends to meet." "Coincidence," Eleanor countered, the academic vocabulary of her former life emerging from dormancy. "Perhaps," Daniel conceded with a slight nod. "Or perhaps the storm had purpose beyond its own nature." Eleanor frowned, instinctively rejecting any suggestion of supernatural intervention. Had she not witnessed firsthand the absolute indifference of the universe to human suffering? What divine plan could possibly justify the slaughter she had witnessed, the solitary burden she had carried? Daniel seemed to read these thoughts in her expression. "Not all meaning comes from above," he clarified. "Sometimes it grows from the ground beneath our feet, from connections we do not recognize until they have already taken root." The philosophical turn of conversation awakened long-dormant aspects of Eleanor's mind. For years, her intellect had focused exclusively on immediate survival, shrinking from broader contemplation that might lead back to unbearable memory. Now, engaged with ideas rather than merely reaction, she felt something shift within. Not healing, certainly, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that healing might be conceptually possible. "The storm weakens," Daniel observed after a comfortable silence had settled between them. "But travel remains dangerous for someone without proper equipment or knowledge of winter ways. You may remain here until paths clear, if you choose." The offer, presented without pressure or expectation, allowed Eleanor dignity often denied by charitable gestures. This subtle distinction, being granted choice rather than subjected to assistance, resonated with the fierce independence that had sustained her through years of isolation. "Why would you shelter a stranger?" she asked, genuine puzzlement overriding suspicion. Daniel arranged several small stones in a pattern beside the fire. A habit she would later learn indicated thoughtful consideration. "Many winters ago, when I first walked the medicine path, my teacher spoke words I carry. We heal ourselves by healing others. Perhaps in offering shelter, I also find it." The cryptic response suggested depths to Daniel's own story that matched her reluctance to reveal personal history. This mutual recognition of boundaries, unspoken yet honored, established the foundation for what would gradually evolve from wary coexistence into something neither could yet imagine. As the day progressed, Eleanor observed Daniel's routine with anthropological detachment, the methodical preparation of medicines from dried plants, the careful maintenance of essential tools. the respectful rituals that preceded even mundane activities like cooking or gathering water from melted snow. Her academic mind, awakening from long dormancy, found fascination in these unfamiliar practices. When evening returned, bringing with it another snowfall, less violent but equally persistent as its predecessor, Eleanor made her decision. She would remain until weather permitted safe travel, accepting temporary shelter while maintaining the emotional distance essential to her fragile equilibrium. What she could not possibly anticipate was how this pragmatic choice would ultimately challenge every defensive barrier she had constructed around her wounded spirit. The storm had driven her to this unexpected sanctuary. Only time would reveal whether it had delivered her to further desolation or the first tentative steps toward reclaiming her humanity. Days stretched into weeks as winter tightened its grip on the prairie. The rhythm of life in Daniel's earth. Lodge followed patterns dictated by necessity and tradition rather than arbitrary human schedules. Eleanor found herself adapting to this new temporal framework, where activities were determined by daylight, weather conditions, and essential tasks rather than clockwork precision. Initially, she maintained a vigilant distance, speaking only when practical communication required it. Her responses emerged in truncated phrases, the linguistic equivalent of a wounded animal testing an injured limb. Daniel never pressed for more, accepting her halting speech with the same equanimity he displayed toward all aspects of their coexistence. The first significant shift occurred during a bitter cold spell that confined them entirely to the lodge. For 4 consecutive days, Eleanor's restlessness manifested as obsessive reorganization of her meager possessions, primarily her journal and the few items she'd carried in her tattered dress pockets. Observing this agitation, Daniel retrieved a small bundle from his storage area. "Hands need purpose," he said, unwrapping the package to reveal strips of tanned deer hide, sinew thread, bone needles, and colorful porcupine quills. When thoughts circle like hungry wolves, fingers can lead them to quieter paths. He demonstrated a simple stitching technique, creating a small pouch with methodical efficiency. Then, without expectation or instruction, he arranged a portion of the materials within Eleanor's reach and returned to his own work, grinding dried roots into medicinal powder. Eleanor observed the offered supplies with initial suspicion that gradually yielded to genuine interest. In her previous life, she had possessed considerable skill with needle and thread, not merely decorative embroidery, but practical creation and repair of essential items. This fragment of her former self stirred like a dormant seed, encountering unexpected spring rain. With tentative movements, she selected materials and began mimicking the technique she had observed. Her first attempts were clumsy, fingers stiff from cold and disuse, but muscle memory gradually reasserted itself. By evening, she had completed a small, imperfect pouch similar to Daniel's demonstration. "The hands remember what the mind tries to forget," Daniel observed when she hesitantly displayed her creation. The insight, offered without psychological pretension, struck Eleanor with the force of profound truth. Physical skills had indeed survived when so much else had been lost. This realization became a turning point. In subsequent days, Eleanor began accepting Daniel's casual offers to share knowledge, how to process certain plants for their medicinal properties, techniques for preserving food, methods of predicting weather changes from subtle environmental cues. These practical exchanges required minimal personal disclosure, yet provided structured interaction that gradually eased her back into human connection. One morning, as they worked together sorting seed pods from a healing plant, Daniel called sleep a bringer. Eleanor found herself studying his methodical movements. His hands, strong yet capable of remarkable delicacy when treating the fragile plant material, bore intricate tattoos across the knuckles and wrists, symbols whose meaning she couldn't decipher. "What do they represent?" she asked, gesturing toward the markings. Daniel glanced at his hands as if seeing them anew through her inquiry. "Stories," he replied. "Each symbol speaks of a journey, a vision, a healing completed." He extended his right hand, palm downward, indicating a particularly elaborate design. "This one recalls the summer I walked 40 days without water vision, guided only by a hawk messenger." Eleanor's academic curiosity, long dormant beneath layers of trauma, flickered to life. "Your people record history through body markings rather than written language." "Not instead of, alongside," Daniel corrected. "We have pictographic records on buffalo hide for community history. These markings are personal testament, visible only when I choose to reveal them." The concept fascinated Eleanor, who had once taught her students that civilization's advancement could be measured by progression from oral to written tradition. Here was an entirely different approach, embodied knowledge literally inscribed on the self. "In your culture," Daniel continued, seemingly encouraged by her interest, "words stand separate from the speaker on silent pages. In mine, some knowledge cannot be separated from the person who carries it." Eleanor considered this perspective, comparing it to her journal, words committed to paper precisely because they felt too dangerous to contain within herself. "Different approaches to the same human need," she observed, "preserving what matters beyond a single lifetime." Daniel nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression at her comprehension. This exchange, their first that transcended mere practical communication, established a new dimension to their coexistence. Eleanor had engaged not just with survival techniques, but with an alternate worldview, a cognitive bridge extending beyond her psychological isolation. The pattern continued as winter deepened. Practical knowledge sharing gradually expanded to include explanatory context, not just how to identify medicinal plants, but why certain rituals accompanied their gathering. Not merely techniques for preserving food, but the cultural significance of various preparation methods. Each conversation revealed layers of understanding that challenged Eleanor's formerly rigid categorization of knowledge. As her verbal communication expanded, Eleanor found herself confronting an unexpected dilemma. The more she engaged with present reality, the more difficult it became to maintain the protective dissociation that had shielded her from past trauma. Nightmares, which had been constant companions during her years of wandering, intensified in both frequency and vividity. She would wake, gasping, momentarily unable to distinguish between waking life and dream terror. Daniel never acknowledged these nocturnal disturbances directly. Instead, he developed a pattern of quietly adding wood to the central fire whenever her troubled sleep became evident, then preparing a mild sedative tea that would be waiting when she inevitably abandoned. Further sleep attempts, this unobtrusive support, help offered without requiring explicit acknowledgement of weakness, allowed Eleanor to maintain essential dignity while gradually accepting assistance. One particularly difficult night, after a nightmare of exceptional intensity, Eleanor found herself clutching her journal with trembling hands. Daniel, as had become his custom, tended the fire in silence. Without conscious decision, Eleanor spoke. "I was a teacher," she said, voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Before." Daniel added another log to the fire, his movements deliberate. "Teaching is respected work among my people," he responded, matching her subdued tone. "Knowledge, improperly shared, becomes stronger, like a flame passed from one torch to many." The simple acknowledgement, neither pressing for details nor dismissing her disclosure, created space for Eleanor to continue if she chose. After several minutes of silence, she did. "I taught children to read, to understand numbers, to see beyond their immediate surroundings." The words emerged haltingly, each one a stone disturbing long, still waters. I believed education could transform lives, open doors closed by circumstance or birth. Daniel listened without interruption, his attention evident, though he maintained focus on the fire rather than watching her directly. A deliberateness she had come to recognize as consideration for her discomfort with direct observation. Now I question whether knowledge offers protection against life's cruelties, she concluded, an entire philosophical shift compressed into a single sentence. Daniel arranged several small stones around the fire's edge, a habit she had noticed, accompanied his deeper contemplations. "Knowledge is not armor," he finally said. "It cannot prevent an arrow's strike or winter's cold, but it determines whether the wound festers or heals, whether cold brings death or adaptation." The observation contained no platitudes about her specific loss, no hollow reassurances that education might have prevented tragedy. Instead, it acknowledged reality while suggesting perspective beyond her current viewpoint. Precisely the approach she had once employed with students struggling with difficult concepts. "You were a teacher too," Eleanor realized aloud. A rare smile briefly transformed Daniel's normally stoic features. "Among my people, medicine work and teaching cannot be separated. Healing requires understanding. Understanding creates possibility." For healing, this exchange marked another threshold crossed. Eleanor had shared not merely facts about her former identity, but something of her shattered worldview. Daniel had responded not with conventional comfort, but with perspective that honored her intellectual capacity. The interaction left something altered between them. Not friendship exactly, but mutual recognition of each other's complexity. As winter progressed toward its zenith, practical necessity pushed their relationship toward deeper cooperation. The coldest days required combined effort to maintain adequate warmth, preserve food supplies, and address the myriad challenges of survival in such extreme conditions. Working together, they developed nonverbal communication, anticipating each other's movements in the confined space, passing tools without explicit request, adapting to each other's rhythms in the completion of essential tasks. During this period, Eleanor began recording her observations in her journal again. Not the fragmented ramblings of her wandering years, but coherent documentation of daily activities, medicinal knowledge gleaned from Daniel, and occasional reflections on the differences between her previous understanding and new perspectives. This return to systematic recording represented significant cognitive reintegration, though she still carefully avoided direct reference to the traumatic memories that remained sealed behind mental barriers. One afternoon, as a rare winter thaw briefly softened the landscape outside their shelter, Daniel returned from checking his snare lines with an unusual request. "Tomorrow I must journey to perform a healing ritual," he explained, laying out several rabbits from his successful hunt. "A family from my band winters separately 2 hours' walk from here. Their youngest child struggles with lung sickness. They have sent smoke signals requesting medical help." Eleanor nodded, immediately understanding the practical implications. "I will maintain the fire during your absence. The journey requires overnight stay," Daniel continued. "Child's treatment needs attention through darkness hours. I will return the morning after tomorrow." The prospect of being alone again, even temporarily, even in the relative safety of the Earth Lodge, sent an unexpected wave of anxiety through Eleanor. She had grown accustomed to Daniel's steady presence, the quiet reassurance of another human being within sight and sound, yet she recognized the importance of his healing work. "I understand," she said, managing to keep her voice steady. "What preparations should we make before your departure?" Daniel seemed to sense her unspoken concern. "You have learned much," he observed. "The fire-keeping, the food preparation, the warning signs of weather change. Your hands now know these things. the subtle vote of confidence framing her ability to manage alone as established fact rather than questionable possibility, helped steady Eleanor's resolve. They spent the remainder of the day in practical preparation, ensuring adequate firewood within easy reach, preparing food that would require minimal effort during his absence, reviewing essential safety measures against winter's unpredictable threats. The following morning, Daniel departed at first light, carrying a carefully packed bundle of medicinal supplies. Eleanor stood at the lodge entrance, watching until his figure disappeared into the winter landscape, then resolutely turned to the day's necessary tasks. Initially, focusing on practical activities kept anxiety at bay. Eleanor maintained the fire, prepared a simple meal, and organized supplies with mechanical efficiency. As daylight began fading, however, the lodge's silence grew oppressive. Without Daniel's quiet presence, the normal sounds of the structure, the settling of support poles, the flutter of the smoke flap adjusting to wind changes, the subtle creaking of frozen earth, seemed suddenly ominous. Eleanor found herself straining for sounds beyond the lodge, startling at the occasional crack of frost-stressed tree limbs or distant animal call. The rational portion of her mind recognized these reactions as hypervigilance, an exaggerated startle response common to those who had experienced severe trauma. Understanding the psychological mechanism, however, did little to mitigate its physical manifestations. As darkness deepened, Eleanor realized she faced a critical choice: surrender to escalating panic or actively apply techniques she had observed in Daniel's approach to challenging circumstances. Taking a deliberate breath, she gathered materials she had seen him use during evening meditations: a small bundle of dried sweetgrass, a polished stone bowl, a striker for creating sparks, mimicking his methodical movements as closely as memory. Aloud, Eleanor arranged these items near the central fire. She had no illusion that merely replicating physical actions would produce spiritual results, but the deliberate focus required helped center her scattered attention. The familiar scent of burning sweetgrass, now associated with safety rather than unfamiliarity, gradually helped ease the tightness in her chest. That night, alone in the lodge, Eleanor faced her first significant test since beginning this unexpected period of recovery. Nightmares came, as she had feared they would, but something had shifted in her response to them. Rather than being entirely consumed by terror, she maintained a thin thread of awareness that distinguished between past trauma and present reality. This fragile distinction, the beginning of what modern psychology would later term grounding, represented profound progress in her healing journey. When Daniel returned late the following morning, visibly tired but satisfied with the young patient's improvement, he found Eleanor changed in subtle but significant ways. Her greeting, though still reserved, carried genuine warmth. The lodge showed evidence of not merely maintained order, but thoughtful improvements, reorganized storage areas, prepared materials for activities they had planned before his departure, even decorative elements using techniques he had demonstrated weeks earlier. "The child will recover," he reported, settling gratefully beside the well-maintained fire. "The family sends gratitude for medicine that eases breathing." Eleanor nodded, then surprised both of them by asking, "What was the treatment you used?" This inquiry, showing interest beyond her immediate circumstances, marked another threshold. Crossed. Daniel described the combination of herb infusions, steam treatments, and symbolic rituals that comprised the healing practice. Eleanor listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed both her scientific background and newly developing appreciation for approaches outside her previous framework. As winter's grip began showing the first tentative signs of loosening, slightly longer daylight, occasional periods of relative warmth, subtle changes in wildlife behavior, Eleanor's reintegration continued progressing in parallel with the seasonal transition. Her speech patterns gradually recovered complexity and nuance, Her movements lost the perpetual tension of flight readiness. Her engagement with daily activities expanded from mere survival to include elements of curiosity and even occasional pleasure. The journal, that had once contained primarily fragmented observations and emotional processing, began incorporating systematic documentation of Pawnee medicinal knowledge, detailed drawings of plants with notes on preparation methods, descriptions of treatment, approaches for various ailments, even comparative observations between Western medical practices she had previously learned and the integrated physical-spiritual healing philosophy Daniel embodied. This scholarly activity, reconnecting Eleanor to her intellectual foundations while incorporating new understanding, created a bridge between her former self and potential future identity. Without directly confronting the traumatic chasm that separated these two versions of herself, she was gradually constructing an alternative path around its edges. Daniel observed these changes with quiet approval, gradually increasing the complexity of knowledge he shared as her capacity for integration expanded. Their discussions evolved from primarily practical exchanges to include philosophical dimensions, perspectives on the relationship between humans and the natural world, approaches to understanding suffering's place in life's cycle, concepts of healing that transcended mere physical recovery. What neither could have anticipated was how this period of growth and adaptation would be suddenly tested by unexpected intrusion from the world beyond their isolated winter sanctuary, a world with very different ideas about appropriate boundaries between their respective cultures. The first true sign of spring arrived with surprising gentleness, not the dramatic thaw Eleanor had anticipated, but a gradual softening of winter's harsh edges. Birdsong returned to the surrounding landscape, tentative at first, then increasingly confident as migratory species reclaimed their territorial perches. The snow receded in stages, revealing patches of dormant prairie grass that quickly transformed from dull brown to vibrant green under the strengthening sun. For Eleanor, this seasonal transition sparked complex emotions. The winter months in Daniel's Earth Lodge had provided unexpected sanctuary, a protected space to begin rebuilding fragments of her shattered self. With spring's arrival came implicit questions about future directions, questions neither she nor Daniel had directly addressed during their shared isolation. Their daily rhythms shifted with the changing season. Foraging expeditions replaced winter's indoor focus, venturing increasingly further from the lodge to gather emerging medicinal plants and fresh food sources. Eleanor found herself absorbing new knowledge with the methodical precision that had once characterized her teaching approach, documenting plant identification features, optimal harvesting techniques, and preparation methods in her increasingly organized journal. On one such expedition, as they carefully collected early spring roots from a south-facing hillside, Daniel paused in his work, his attention drawn to the distant horizon. Riders, he observed, his tone neutral but carrying a subtle note of concern. Eleanor followed his gaze, squinting against the bright spring sunlight. At first, she saw nothing beyond the rolling prairie landscape. Then movement caught her eye, 3 mounted figures approaching from the east, following what appeared to be a crude trail that passed within a quarter-mile of their current position. Instinctively, Eleanor shifted toward concealment behind a nearby stand of brush. The movement was automatic, a protective response developed during her years of avoiding human contact. Daniel remained where he stood, neither hiding nor signaling, simply observing with the careful assessment that characterized his approach to potential threat. Army patrol, he noted, as the riders drew near enough for features to become discernible. 2 soldiers, 1 scout. The recognition sent a cold wave through Eleanor's body, despite the mild spring air. Military presence in this region typically centered on monitoring native movements, managing potential conflicts between settlers and indigenous populations, and enforcing the ever-shifting boundaries established by treaties routinely violated. Before the ink had dried, "Will they see us?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel considered the rider's trajectory. "They follow the established route to Fort Sullivan," he observed, "not searching, merely passing." The assessment proved accurate as the small patrol continued along their path without deviation, apparently unaware of the observers on the hillside. Eleanor watched until they disappeared over the next rise, her heart gradually returning to normal rhythm. "They travel with purpose," Daniel commented once the riders had vanished from view. "Military movements increase with spring, watching boundaries, delivering messages between forts." Eleanor nodded, understanding the implications. Their winter isolation, the protective cocoon that had sheltered her fragile recovery, was ending. The wider world, with its rigid categories and harsh judgments, would inevitably intrude upon the delicate balance they had established. "We should return," she suggested, suddenly eager for the security of the Earth Lodge. That evening, as they prepared the day's gathered plants for storage and use, Eleanor found herself unusually preoccupied. The patrol sighting had disturbed something fundamental in her slowly rebuilding sense of security. Daniel, observant as always, allowed her distracted silence until their meal was completed. "The soldiers brought shadows to your thoughts," he finally commented, neither questioning nor demanding explanation. Eleanor arranged several small stones in a circle, unconsciously adopting Daniel's habit for organizing contemplation. "Their presence reminds me of this." She hesitated, gesturing to encompass the lodge and their shared existence. "Is not how the outside world operates." Daniel added wood to the central fire, the flames illuminating his thoughtful expression. "Different worlds exist alongside each other," he observed, "sometimes touching, sometimes separate, neither fully aware of the other's true nature." "But those soldiers," Eleanor countered, "represent a world that defines strict boundaries between your people and mine, a world with very specific ideas about appropriate relationships across those boundaries." The statement hung between them, the first explicit acknowledgement of potential external judgment regarding their unusual arrangement. Throughout winter, practical survival concerns had rendered such considerations irrelevant. Now, with increasing outside presence, these unaddressed complexities demanded attention. "In the town nearest here," Daniel said after a measured silence, "people speak of the ghost woman who haunts the prairie. Some say she died with her family during an attack. Others believe she lost her mind to grief and wanders in madness. All avoid the areas where she has been sighted." Eleanor stiffened at this unexpected reference to how the world perceived her. "You knew this before you found me in the storm." "I had heard such stories," Daniel confirmed. "When our paths crossed, I saw not a ghost or a mad woman, but a wounded spirit that had not yet found its healing path." "And now?" Eleanor asked, suddenly desperate to understand how he categorized her current state. Daniel studied her with the direct gaze that had become increasingly comfortable between them. "Now I see Eleanor, who survived when others did not, who carries deep wounds yet stands upright, who learns and adapts and slowly reconnects broken pieces of herself." The simple assessment, neither romanticizing her progress nor minimizing her continued struggles, touched something profound in Eleanor. She had spent so long existing as barely human, then gradually recovering fragments of her former self, that she had lost perspective on how others might perceive her current state. "The outside world would not understand what has happened here," she said quietly. "They would see only impropriety, a white woman living unchaperoned with a Pawnee man. They would insist on rescuing me, regardless of my wishes." Daniel nodded, acknowledging this reality without defensiveness. When moon cycles complete their round, my band will return to summer hunting grounds near here. Decisions about paths forward need not be made tonight, the gentle deferral offered. Breathing space, while simultaneously acknowledging the inevitable reckoning ahead. Eleanor accepted this balanced approach, recognizing that forcing premature decisions would undermine the careful healing progress of recent months. Their conversation shifted to more immediate practical concerns, but the awareness of encroaching outside influence had been formally acknowledged. Like the spring thaw transforming the physical landscape, this recognition altered their shared psychological terrain in ways that would gradually reveal their significance. 3 days later, the abstract threat materialized with jarring suddenness. Eleanor was alone at the Earth Lodge, organizing recently gathered medicinal plants while Daniel checked hunting traps at a distant creek. The approaching hoofbeats registered moments before shadows fell across the lodge entrance, too late for concealment or escape. Heart racing, she froze in position as the entrance flap was pushed aside, with the casual entitlement of those accustomed to authority. 2 men entered, a uniformed cavalry officer and a civilian whose expensive, if trail-worn attire marked him as someone of means. Their expressions registered momentary shock at finding a white woman in the native dwelling. "Good Lord!" the civilian exclaimed, recovering first. "It's true!" Jackson said he'd spotted a white woman with the medicine man, but I scarcely believed it. The officer, younger and visibly uncomfortable with the intrusion, maintained a more professional demeanor. "Ma'am," he addressed Eleanor with formal courtesy that contrasted sharply with their uninvited entrance. "I'm Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 7th Cavalry Regiment. This is Mr. Garrett Taylor, Indian Affairs Liaison." Eleanor stood slowly, acutely aware of her appearance, dressed in a practical combination of her original clothing and native-made garments, hair loosely braided rather than properly pinned, hands stained from the plant preparations. Every visible aspect of her person violated proper feminine presentation. "You're trespassing," she stated flatly, summoning the authoritative tone she had once employed to discipline unruly students. The unexpected response clearly took both men aback. The lieutenant glanced at his companion, uncertain how to proceed. Taylor recovered quickly, his expression shifting to practiced concern. "My dear lady," he began, his voice modulated to convey gentle understanding. "We're here to help you. Please tell us your name." The condescension in his tone, addressing her as one might speak to a confused child or mentally unsound person, sparked anger that momentarily overrode Eleanor's anxiety. "Eleanor Mason," she replied coldly. "And I have neither requested nor require your help, Mr. Taylor." Recognition flashed across the liaison's face. "Mason, from the Clearwater Creek settlement." The schoolteacher, his expression transformed with dramatic swiftness. "My God, you're the woman from the Wagon Massacre 4 years ago. Everyone believed you had perished with the others." The direct reference to her trauma hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She gripped the nearby work table for support, struggling to maintain composure as buried memories threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed defenses. "Mrs. Mason," Lieutenant Hayes interjected, his tone gentler than his companion's. "There were inquiries after the attack. Your family back east. They were informed you were presumed dead." Family. The word opened another wound. Her parents in Massachusetts, her younger sister in Philadelphia. They had mourned her, believing they had lost her forever. This realization, that her survival had remained unknown to those who loved her, created fresh complexity in an already overwhelming situation. "How did you come to be here?" Taylor pressed, his gaze sweeping the lodge interior with poorly disguised distaste. "Were you taken captive after the attack?" The implication infuriated Eleanor, providing an emotional anchor against the destabilizing memories threatening to submerge her. "I was not taken anywhere," she stated firmly. "I survived the massacre alone. I buried 17 people with my bare hands before walking away from civilization." Her directness visibly unsettled both men. Such explicit reference to violence violated proper feminine delicacy, particularly when delivered without appropriate emotional display. "And the Indian?" Taylor persisted. "This medicine man you're living with?" "Daniel Rivers saved my life during a blizzard this winter," Eleanor explained, carefully modulating her voice to prevent it from betraying the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. "He offered shelter when I would have frozen to death. He has treated me with nothing but respect." The lieutenant seemed inclined to accept this explanation, but Taylor's expression hardened with skepticism. "Mrs. Mason, whatever you believe about your situation, propriety and decency require your immediate return to proper society. The army post at Fort Sullivan can provide temporary accommodation until arrangements can be made to reunite you with your family." "I am not leaving," Eleanor stated unequivocally. Taylor's facade of concern gave way to authoritative impatience. "This isn't a request, Mrs. Mason. Lieutenant Hayes has the authority to remove you for your own protection. The psychological effects of prolonged traumatic isolation are well documented. Your judgment has been compromised by your ordeal." The dismissal of her agency, cloaked in paternalistic concern, ignited something primal in Eleanor. After years of reclaiming her autonomy first through survival and then through healing, this attempt to categorize her as incapable of determining her own path struck at the core of her recovered identity. "My judgment is perfectly intact, Mr. Taylor," she responded, ice-coating each word. "And it tells me that two men who enter another's dwelling uninvited, then attempt to remove its occupant against her will, are not motivated by concern, but by control." Taylor flushed at the direct confrontation, turning to Hayes with evident expectation of support. The young officer appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Perhaps," Hayes suggested cautiously, "we might discuss this further once Mr. Rivers returns. Proper procedure would involve—" "Proper procedure," Taylor interrupted incredulously. "Lieutenant, this woman has been living in sin with a savage medicine man. There is no procedure beyond immediate removal." The crude characterization provoked Eleanor to dangerous candor. "Daniel Rivers is more civilized than you will ever be, Mr. Taylor. He offered help without demanding submission, shelter without requiring gratitude, healing without imposing shame. What exactly are you offering? Beyond judgment and coercion?" Before Taylor could respond, movement at the lodge entrance drew everyone's attention. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts as he surveyed the tense tableau before him. In one hand, he carried fresh game from his hunting snares. In the other, the distinctive carved wooden staff that marked his status as a medicine man among his people. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Hayes's hand moved instinctively toward his holstered sidearm, though he didn't draw the weapon. Taylor took a half-step back, positioning himself partially behind the officer. "Rivers," Taylor addressed him with forced authority, "we've come to return Mrs. Mason to civilization. Your cooperation will be noted favorably in my report to the Indian Agency." Daniel entered the lodge fully, his movements deliberately measured. He placed the game on a preparation table and set his staff carefully against the wall before responding. "Eleanor makes her own decisions," he stated simply in perfect English, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Taylor's agitation. The clarity and education evident in his speech visibly surprised both visitors. Taylor recovered first, shifting tactics. "The situation is more complicated than you understand," he explained with exaggerated patience. "Mrs. Mason survived a traumatic attack. Her judgment has been affected. Her family believes she is dead. We have a responsibility to return her to proper care." Daniel's gaze shifted to Eleanor, a silent question in his expression. She straightened her posture, drawing strength from his unspoken support. "I'm not leaving," she repeated, this time addressing all three men with unequivocal clarity. "Not today. Not under coercion." Lieutenant Hayes cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Mason, while I respect your fortitude, Mr. Taylor is correct about certain procedural requirements. Your status as a presumed dead massacre survivor creates legal complications that must be addressed through proper channels." Eleanor recognized the shift in approach, from forcible removal to bureaucratic entanglement. In some ways, this presented greater danger as it cloaked control in reasonable-sounding processes. "What exactly are these requirements?" she asked, directing her question to Hayes rather than the openly hostile Taylor. The lieutenant appeared relieved by her willingness to engage with procedure. "You would need to provide a formal statement at Fort Sullivan, documenting your survival and subsequent experiences. The post commander would forward this testimony to territorial authorities, who would initiate a process to amend death records and notify next of kin." "And this requires my physical presence at the fort?" Eleanor pressed. Hayes nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Official documentation requires verification of identity by multiple officers." Eleanor considered this information carefully. Refusing to engage with legal processes wouldn't prevent their enforcement. It would merely position her as actively resistant to legitimate authority, potentially strengthening arguments about her compromised judgment. "I will consider visiting Fort Sullivan," she conceded finally, noting Taylor's triumphant expression with inward distaste. "On my own terms, at a time of my choosing, after appropriate preparation." "That's not," Taylor began, but Hayes interrupted with unexpected firmness. "That seems reasonable, Mrs. Mason. The commander should be informed of your survival, but specific timing can accommodate your circumstances." He turned to Taylor. "The agency's concerns are noted, Mr. Taylor, but forced removal of a white woman, against her explicit wishes, exceeds our current authority without clear evidence of imminent danger." Taylor's face flushed with anger, but he evidently recognized the limits of his influence over military procedure. "The commander will hear about this," he warned, "and the agency will be submitting a formal report about this inappropriate living arrangement." "I'm sure they will," Eleanor replied evenly. "You may inform them that I will present myself at Fort Sullivan within 2 weeks to provide a formal statement. Until then, I would appreciate it if you would respect my privacy and not return to this dwelling uninvited." The dismissal, delivered with the quiet authority she had once wielded in her classroom, left little room for further argument without exposing the visitor's true motives as control rather than concern. Hayes, at least, seemed to recognize this distinction, offering a respectful nod as he gestured for Taylor to precede him toward the exit. 2 weeks, Mrs. Mason," the lieutenant confirmed. "After that, I would be obligated to return with more formal instructions." When they had finally departed, Eleanor's carefully maintained composure crumbled. She sank onto a seating mat, trembling with the aftermath of confrontation and the terror of having her past so abruptly exposed. Daniel moved quietly around the lodge, securing the entrance flap and rekindling the central fire before settling across from her. "They will return," he observed after allowing her time to collect herself. Eleanor nodded. The reality of their situation impossible to deny. They represent systems much larger than themselves: military authority, government agencies, societal expectations. They won't simply forget what they've discovered here. "What will you do?" Daniel asked, neither encouraging or discouraging. "Any particular course?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications that extended far beyond mere legal procedures. Their unusual partnership, begun in crisis, developed through isolation, strengthened by shared knowledge, now faced external judgment that would recognize none of its nuanced value. Eleanor's decision would determine not only her legal status, but the future shape of her identity, whether she would attempt reintegration into the society that had once defined her, or forge a different path that honored the profound transformation of recent months. Both choices carried significant cost. Both offered potential restoration of elements long missing from her life. As twilight descended outside the lodge, Eleanor faced the most consequential decision since the moment she had emerged from beneath the wagon to confront a world irrevocably altered by violence. This time, however, she approached the choice not from desperate isolation, but from the hard-won strength of someone who had begun the journey from survival to healing. "First," she said finally, "I need to write several letters. There are people who have mourned me long enough." The days following the uninvited intrusion unfolded in a strange juxtaposition of mundane routine and profound inner turmoil. Eleanor continued participating in daily activities, gathering plants, preparing food, maintaining the lodge, while simultaneously grappling with the implications of her impending choice. Daniel neither pressed for decisions nor offered unsolicited advice, his steadfast presence providing space for her independent contemplation. 3 days after the confrontation, Eleanor began drafting the first of several letters, perhaps the most difficult correspondence she would ever compose. "Dear Mother and Father," she wrote, the formal address feeling strangely inadequate for breaking 4 years of presumed death. Her pen hesitated above the paper, overwhelmed by the impossibility of condensing her experiences into mere words. How does one explain transformation so profound that the daughter they lost and the woman now writing shared little beyond a name and memories? After several false starts, Eleanor adopted a measured approach, providing essential facts while deferring more complex explanations for future communication. By the time this letter reaches you, you will likely have received official notification of my survival. I write not to explain everything. That would require volumes rather than pages, but to assure you that I am well, of sound mind, and making decisions based on careful consideration rather than duress or confusion. I cannot imagine the grief you have endured believing me lost. For that pain, I am profoundly sorry. Please know that not a day passed when I didn't think of you, even during the darkest periods when my own identity seemed to dissolve into the vastness of this unforgiving land. The attack that claimed Michael and our traveling companions was swift and merciless. I survived by chance, not courage, hidden beneath our wagon while 17 souls I had broken bread with the previous evening were taken. For months afterward, I existed in a state beyond rational thought, beyond proper feeling. I wandered the prairie as something less than human, yet somehow still breathing, still moving forward without purpose or destination. This winter passed, during a blizzard that would have certainly claimed my life. I was found by a Pawnee medicine man named Daniel Rivers. He offered shelter without condition, and over months of patient interaction, helped me gradually reclaim fragments of my former self. Through his different but equally valid understanding of healing, I have begun integrating the broken pieces of my experience into something that may never fully resemble my former life, but now contains possibility beyond mere survival. The letter continued, carefully balancing honesty with protective omission, providing enough information to explain her circumstances without burdening her parents with details that would only cause additional distress. The closing paragraphs addressed the inevitable questions about her future. Please understand that the person who emerges from such experiences cannot simply resume her former life as though the intervening years never occurred. I am not returning east immediately, though I hope for reunion when circumstances allow. My path forward requires integration of who I was, what I endured, and who I have become through both suffering and healing. I know this decision may disappoint your natural desire to have your daughter safely returned home after believing her lost. I understand you may struggle to comprehend choices that seem inexplicable from a distance. All I ask is that you trust that the education and values you instilled in me have not been abandoned, but rather expanded through experiences that have forever altered my understanding of what constitutes meaningful existence. The Eleanor you remember, your devoted daughter, the eager teacher, Michael's loving wife, she died in many ways that terrible morning. What remains carries her memories, her foundation, and her love for you, but must now build something new from these essential elements, combined with hard-won wisdom acquired at tremendous cost. Similar letters followed. One to her sister in Philadelphia, another to the school board in Clearwater Creek, and a final one addressed to Michael's brother in Ohio, the only surviving member of her husband's family. Each required different considerations, different balancing of truth against protective omission, different acknowledgement of relationships permanently altered by her presumed death and unexpected resurrection. To her sister Catherine, Eleanor wrote with greater emotional candor, sharing more of her psychological journey than she dared express to their parents. Dearest Cat, how strange to form your name with pen and paper after speaking it only in dreams these 4 years past. I imagined countless conversations with you during my darkest days, your voice often the only one I could still hear clearly when all else faded into wilderness sounds. I survived, though survival itself became a burden I often wished to set down. The woman you knew, your studious older sister with her books and plans and certainties, she vanished the day I dug 17 graves with bleeding hands. What remained afterward was something feral, disconnected, a creature of pure instinct, with only fragments of human memory. I write not to distress you with these images, but to help you understand why the sister who returns to your knowledge cannot simply step back into her former place. I have inhabited spaces between worlds that our childhood education never acknowledged, existed. I have learned forms of healing that our rational upbringing would have dismissed as primitive superstition. I have discovered strength in places where all conventional wisdom promised only weakness. My rescuer and healing guide, Daniel Rivers, possesses wisdom our educational institutions would never certify yet, which proved more essential to my recovery than any medical treatment available in Eastern hospitals. Through his patient teaching, I've begun reconstructing an identity that honors both who I was and what I've endured. To Michael's brother James, her letter carried the particular weight of addressing family who had mourned not just her, but their own flesh and blood. Dear James, no words can adequately express what it means to connect with Michael's family after these impossible years. Your brother was my anchor, my partner in building what we believed would be our shared future. His loss remains the wound around which all my subsequent experiences have formed. While official reports will confirm my survival in clinical terms, they cannot convey what it means to be the sole witness to the final moments of someone beloved. Michael died protecting Emily Williams, the youngest child in our traveling party. His last act embodied the fundamental goodness that defined his character throughout our marriage. I wish I could offer more comfort regarding his final moments, but truth compels me to admit that the attack was chaotic, brutal, and mercifully swift. What I can share with absolute certainty is that Michael remained the man you knew, brave, principled, and deeply compassionate until his final breath. As Eleanor sealed the final envelope, she became aware of Daniel observing her from across the lodge, his expression thoughtful. "The words flow more easily now," he commented. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the observation extended beyond mere letter writing to encompass her broader reconnection with communication. "Some barriers remain," she acknowledged. "Certain experiences, still resist language. She ran her fingers over the sealed letters, each containing fragments of her story tailored to specific recipients. When I taught literature to older students, I emphasized that words shape reality as much as they describe it. Now I understand that principle more profoundly. By writing these accounts, I'm not merely reporting what happened, but actively creating the narrative that connects my past to whatever future awaits. Daniel nodded, his expression reflecting appreciation for her insight. This is why our medicine songs must be performed exactly as they were given in vision. Each word carries power beyond its meaning. Eleanor considered this parallel between his spiritual tradition and her own literary understanding. In my former life, I would have categorized such beliefs as superstition. Now I recognize them as different expressions of the same fundamental truth, that language isn't merely descriptive, but generative. Your education runs deeper than books, Daniel observed. As does yours, Eleanor replied. Though neither system would likely recognize the validity of the other. This shared recognition of parallel wisdom traditions had become a recurring theme in their discussions, identifying how different cultural frameworks often arrived at similar essential truths through vastly different approaches. This pattern of connection across apparent division had profoundly influenced Eleanor's evolving perspective on her own fractured identity. Daniel arranged several stones in a small circle, a gesture she now recognized as his preparation for sharing deeper wisdom. In healing work, we understand that some wounds speak through body rather than voice, through dreams, through involuntary remembering, through changes in how one moves through the world. Like an animal favoring an injured limb long after the visible wound has healed, Eleanor suggested. Yes, Daniel confirmed, appreciation flickering in his eyes at her comprehension. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, carries truth, even when words fail. This perspective, so different from the rational, language-centered approach of her previous education, had gradually transformed Eleanor's understanding of her own healing process. She had begun recognizing how certain physical responses, her vigilant posture, her avoidance of confined spaces, her heightened startle reflex, articulated trauma, her conscious mind still struggled to integrate. "I must go to Fort Sullivan," she stated finally, the decision crystallizing even as she spoke it, not because they demand it, but because hiding serves no purpose now that my survival is known. Daniel nodded, neither surprised nor judgmental, about her choice. "When? 3 days from now," Eleanor determined. "Time enough to prepare properly, not so long that they grow suspicious of delay." The practical implications of this decision occupied them for the remainder of the day, gathering appropriate clothing, discussing transportation options, planning for Eleanor's first sustained contact with the military outpost that represented the nearest approximation of civilization in the territory. That evening, as they shared a quiet meal, Eleanor broached the question that had hovered unspoken since the visitor's departure. "Will you accompany me to the fort?" Daniel considered carefully before responding. "My presence would complicate your situation," he observed. "Those who already question your judgment would see me as evidence of undue influence." Though logical, his assessment left Eleanor facing the prospect of navigating this crucial interaction alone, her first significant independent engagement with authority since before the massacre. The anxiety this prospect triggered must have registered in her expression. "However," Daniel continued, "I will travel with you to the fort's perimeter. The journey itself presents challenges for a solitary traveler." The compromise acknowledged both practical concerns and Eleanor's still developing confidence in social situations. Their preparations expanded accordingly, planning an overnight camp for the journey, assembling appropriate supplies, discussing strategies for Eleanor's interaction with military authorities. The morning of their departure dawned clear and mild, perfect spring weather for travel. As they secured the Earth Lodge for temporary absence, Eleanor experienced a surprising emotional response. She was leaving what had become, against all expectation, a place of safety and healing. The structure that had initially appeared primitive and alien now represented sanctuary in her mind, its circular design and natural materials offering protection both physical and psychological. "In my culture," Daniel explained, as they completed the closing rituals he performed whenever leaving the lodge for extended periods, "a dwelling is not merely shelter, but a living entity that participates in our well-being. We thank it for protection. Acknowledge its spirit." Eleanor watched as he placed small offerings at the cardinal directions around the lodge's perimeter, a practice she would once have dismissed as meaningless superstition, but now recognized as profound acknowledgement of the relationship between humans and their environment. The gratitude she felt toward this simple structure transcended rational explanation, yet felt undeniably authentic. "I understand now," she said quietly. "When I first arrived, I saw only crude shelter compared to proper buildings. Now I recognize how its design reflects wisdom my education never included, how the circular space eliminates hierarchical positioning, how the central fire creates communal focus, how the smoke hole connects interior life with the broader universe." Daniel nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Your eyes have learned to see beyond first impressions." "Some lessons require unlearning previous certainties," Eleanor acknowledged. Their journey progressed smoothly, following game trails that Daniel identified as most efficient for their destination. The landscape gradually transformed as they traveled, from the open prairie surrounding the winter camp to more varied terrain with increased tree cover and rolling hills. Eleanor found herself identifying plant species they encountered, mentally cataloging medicinal and food sources as Daniel had taught her, a knowledge overlay that changed her perception of the environment from generic wilderness to nuanced ecosystem filled with potential resources and specific relationships. By mid-afternoon, they had covered a considerable distance. Eleanor moved with confidence that would have astonished her former self, navigating uneven terrain with practiced efficiency, reading weather signs from cloud formations, maintaining awareness of their surroundings that balanced caution with appreciation. Glimpses of her earlier scholarly self emerged in her detailed observations, but now integrated with practical knowledge acquired through direct experience rather than academic study. "We approach military survey territory," Daniel noted as they created a particular rise. "The fort considers these areas under their protection." Eleanor nodded, noticing subtle differences in the landscape, occasional stumps where trees had been harvested for construction, a distant scar on a hillside where wagons had established an informal trail. The evidence of settler presence grew incrementally more pronounced as they continued westward. As dusk approached, they established camp in a sheltered location near a small stream. Their preparations followed well-established patterns developed. During their smaller excursions from the lodge, Daniel focusing on shelter construction and security considerations, while Eleanor gathered appropriate plants and prepared their evening meal. The division of labor had evolved naturally based on respective skills rather than prescribed gender roles, another departure from the strictly defined expectations of Eleanor's previous life. After preparing a simple meal over their modest fire, they sat in comfortable silence, each absorbed in private thoughts about the coming day's challenges. Eventually, Eleanor voiced the concern that had increasingly occupied her mind as they neared Fort Sullivan. "What happens after tomorrow? After I've satisfied their bureaucratic requirements?" Daniel added a small branch to their fire before responding. "What do you wish would happen?" The question, simple yet profound, forced Eleanor to articulate desires she had only partially acknowledged to herself. "I don't belong in their world anymore," she began slowly. "Not as I once did. The parameters that defined appropriate behavior, suitable aspirations, acceptable relationships. They seem arbitrary now, constructed rather than natural." Daniel listened attentively, his expression revealing neither agreement nor disagreement, simply presence with her process. "Yet I can't simply abandon my former life entirely," Eleanor continued. "There are connections worth preserving, knowledge worth retaining, parts of myself I don't wish to surrender. Perhaps the choice is not between worlds, but between perspectives," Daniel suggested. "Not where you stand, but how you see." The observation resonated deeply. Throughout their months together, Daniel had never advocated complete adoption of his cultural practices or abandonment of her background. Instead, he had consistently demonstrated integration, valuing traditional knowledge while adapting to changing circumstances, maintaining spiritual practices while engaging practically with settler society when necessary. The medicine path teaches that healing often requires taking what seems broken beyond repair and creating something new from its pieces, Daniel explained. Not restoration to the former state, but transformation into a different wholeness. This concept, transformation rather than restoration, offered a framework for Eleanor's emerging identity. She wasn't recovering her pre-massacre self, nor adopting a completely new persona, but integrating disparate experiences into cohesive personhood that transcended simplistic categorization. "Your letters," Daniel observed. "They spoke to your past connections. What did they ask for?" "Understanding," Eleanor replied after consideration. "Not permission, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that my path forward must honor what I've experienced rather than deny it." Daniel nodded. "Tomorrow you will speak the same truth to those whose power exists in documents and regulations. They will understand or not understand according to their capacity. Either way, your truth remains." The conversation shifted to practical matters, what documentation the fort commander might require, how Eleanor should present her narrative, to satisfy official requirements while maintaining personal boundaries. Eventually, they banked the fire and prepared for sleep, each recognizing the significance of the coming day's events. Morning brought renewed purpose and final preparations. As they broke camp and continued their journey, Eleanor reviewed her approach for the imminent interactions. By mid-morning, Fort Sullivan became visible in the distance, a stark, geometric interruption in the otherwise organic landscape, its straight lines and right angles proclaiming human domination rather than cooperation with natural surroundings. They halted at the agreed boundary point, a small rise overlooking the fort and surrounding cleared area. From this vantage, Eleanor could observe activity within the military installation. Soldiers drilling in the central yard, wagons delivering supplies, the routine functions of frontier governance proceeding with methodical predictability. "This is where we separate," Daniel confirmed, helping Eleanor adjust her modest pack containing essential items for her fort visit. "The eastern path leads directly to the main entrance. They will have been informed to expect you." Eleanor nodded, sudden anxiety constricting her throat despite thorough preparation. This moment represented her first deliberate re-entry into society after years of isolation, followed by months of protected recovery. Whatever transpired inside those wooden walls would determine not just her legal status, but her future relationship with the world beyond their private sanctuary. Daniel seemed to sense her momentary hesitation. "Remember," he said quietly, "they see only what they expect to see unless shown otherwise. Your strength lies in knowing truths they cannot recognize unless you choose to reveal them." The insight steadied her. Eleanor had spent her teaching, Career, helping students recognize limitations in their perception, encouraging them to see beyond immediate appearances. Now she needed to apply that same principle to her own circumstances, recognizing that others' limited understanding didn't diminish her reality. "I'll return by sunset tomorrow," she confirmed their arrangement. "If I haven't returned by the following morning, I will find you," Daniel assured her, the simple statement carrying profound commitment. With a final exchange of glances that communicated more than words could express, Eleanor began the solitary walk toward Fort Sullivan, her posture gradually shifting from the comfortable familiarity she maintained with Daniel to the more formal bearing expected in civilized interaction. As she approached the fort's entrance, activity near the gate suggested her arrival had been noted. A young soldier stood to attention, clearly assigned to watch for her specifically. Upon confirming her identity, he escorted her directly to the commander's office, a courtesy that simultaneously acknowledged her status as a respectable white woman while ensuring she didn't wander unaccompanied through the military installation. Colonel William Harrison, Fort Sullivan's commanding officer, proved different from Eleanor's expectations. Rather than the harsh disciplinarian frontier mythology might suggest, she encountered a thoughtful, middle-aged officer whose manner indicated extensive education and considerable administrative experience. "Mrs. Mason," he greeted her with formal courtesy, rising from behind his desk as she was shown into his office. "Your appearance resolves what has been considered a closed matter for several years now. Please, be seated." Eleanor took the offered chair, noting the presence of a second officer who was introduced as Lieutenant Collins, serving as official witness to her statement. A clerk sat unobtrusively in the corner, prepared to transcribe the proceedings. "Lieutenant Hayes informed me of your unique circumstances," Harrison continued, his careful phrasing suggesting awareness of potential sensitivities. "I understand. You've been through extraordinary experiences since the unfortunate events of 1873. "Yes, Colonel," Eleanor confirmed, maintaining the composed demeanor she had practiced. "I appreciate your willingness to receive my statement directly rather than insisting on more dramatic intervention." Harrison acknowledged this with a slight nod. "Military authority in territorial matters requires judicious application, Mrs. Mason, particularly in situations involving civilians with legal ambiguities." The initial interview proceeded with surprising efficiency. Eleanor provided essential facts regarding her survival of the massacre, her subsequent period of isolation, and her eventual rescue by Daniel during the winter blizzard. She deliberately framed her narrative to satisfy official requirements while protecting deeper personal experiences from bureaucratic scrutiny. Harrison listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never pressing on points where Eleanor's responses became more guarded. The clerk's pen scratched steadily across official forms, transforming lived experience into documented history with each carefully composed paragraph. "This provides sufficient information for official purposes," Harrison confirmed, when the basic chronology had been established. "Lieutenant Collins will prepare formal documentation revising your status from presumed deceased to living survivor. This will initiate the process for notifying appropriate authorities and next of kin." "I've already written to my family," Eleanor informed him. "I hoped the letters might be included with official correspondence." Harrison agreed to this arrangement, accepting the sealed envelopes she had prepared. As the lieutenant and clerk organized the completed documentation, the colonel addressed the more complicated aspects of her situation with unexpected directness. "Mr. Taylor from Indian Affairs has submitted rather strongly worded recommendations regarding your living arrangements," he stated, his tone carefully neutral. He suggests temporary guardianship until your family can arrange suitable accommodation or escort. Eleanor had anticipated this attempt to assert control over her movements. I'm a 30-year-old widow, Colonel, not an underage girl or person of diminished capacity. My current arrangements reflect practical considerations and personal choice, rather than coercion or compromise. Harrison studied her with measured assessment. Your circumstances are certainly unconventional, Mrs. Mason. However, military authority doesn't extend to dictating living arrangements for mentally competent civilians, absent evidence of illegal activity or imminent danger. This pragmatic approach, focusing on jurisdictional limitations rather than moral judgment, offered Eleanor unexpected latitude. Then my legal status is regularized by providing this statement, no further official requirements. There are practical considerations, Harrison clarified. Your property in Clearwater Creek was redistributed after your presumed death. The school board appointed a replacement teacher. Certain legal procedures would be necessary should you wish to reclaim specific assets or positions. I understand, Eleanor acknowledged. Those are matters for future consideration rather than immediate concern. As the interview concluded, Harrison offered one final observation. Mrs. Mason, frontier territories operate with certain flexibility unavailable in more established regions. Many find this environment allows for unconventional arrangements that might face greater scrutiny elsewhere. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Mr. Rivers is known to this fort as an occasional interpreter and guide. His reputation among both native communities and military personnel is respected. The subtle message wasn't lost on Eleanor. Harrison was indicating that while he couldn't officially sanction her living situation, neither would he actively interfere absent specific complaints or problems. This qualified neutrality represented perhaps the best outcome possible from formal authorities. I appreciate your candor, Colonel, Eleanor replied, matching his diplomatic approach. The territorial experience seems to foster pragmatic assessment rather than rigid adherence to conventions that may serve little purpose in these circumstances. Harrison's expression suggested appreciation for her perceptive analysis. I served 3 years in Washington before this assignment, Mrs. Mason. The difference between policy as conceived in distant offices and reality as experienced on the frontier is educational. He reorganized several papers on his desk before continuing. Those of us tasked with maintaining order in these regions quickly learn that flexibility often serves peace better than strict enforcement of regulations designed for entirely different contexts. A lesson that might benefit many institutions, Eleanor observed. Indeed, Harrison agreed, though I would caution that such perspectives, while practical here, might encounter significant resistance in more established communities. He cleared his throat slightly. The Indian Affairs representative, Mr. Taylor, represents certain institutional viewpoints that prioritize clear separation between settler and native populations. His recommendations reflect official policy rather than territorial reality. I've encountered similar disconnections between theory and practice in educational methodology, Eleanor noted, deliberately establishing common ground through professional parallelism. The most elegantly designed curriculum often requires significant adaptation when confronted with actual classroom conditions. Harrison nodded, appreciating the analogy. Precisely. My authority extends to maintaining order and protecting legitimate interests, not dictating personal arrangements that harm no one. However, he added with subtle emphasis, should complaints arise from either community, my flexibility would necessarily diminish. The warning, though gently delivered, contained clear implications. Eleanor's unconventional situation would be tolerated only so long as it remained sufficiently private and unproblematic for authorities. Public scandal or community pressure would force official intervention regardless of Harrison's personal inclinations toward pragmatism. With documentation completed and her legal status provisionally restored, Eleanor was offered accommodation in the fort's visitor quarters for the night. She accepted, recognizing that immediate return to Daniel might undermine the independence she had carefully established during the interview. The simple room, sparsely furnished but clean and private, represented her first night in civilization since before the massacre. As darkness fell over the fort, Eleanor sat beside the small window, watching military routine unfold with mechanical precision below. Lamps were lit, guard rotations changed, evening activities proceeded according to established protocol. The ordered predictability contrasted sharply with the organic rhythms that had governed her recent months: sunrise and sunset, weather patterns, seasonal transitions. The fort's organization reflected core values she had once embraced without question: efficiency, hierarchy, mastery over environment rather than adaptation to it. Each building served a designated function. Each person occupied a specific rank within a clearly defined chain of command. Each activity followed a predetermined schedule regardless of natural conditions. The settlers' approach to existence centered on imposing human systems onto landscape rather than integrating within existing patterns. A memory surfaced from her teaching days, explaining to frontier children why standardized time with mechanical clocks represented progress over reliance on sundials or natural markers. Civilization advances by creating consistency and predictability, she had told them with complete conviction. By freeing ourselves from nature's inconsistencies, we achieve greater efficiency and prosperity. Now, watching soldiers perform identical actions at prescribed intervals, regardless of environmental conditions, Eleanor recognized both the strengths and limitations of this approach. The fort's operations demonstrated impressive coordination and resource management, yet also revealed profound disconnection from the natural systems surrounding it, the very systems that ultimately determine survival in this harsh territory. In this structured environment, surrounded by the trappings of the society she had once unquestioningly inhabited, Eleanor confronted the full magnitude of her transformation. The woman who had taught multiplication tables and proper penmanship in Clearwater Creek, who had believed in linear progress and civilizing influence, would have recognized nothing of value in Eleanor's years of feral survival or months of healing through practices her former self would have dismissed as primitive superstition. Yet her current self could still appreciate the benefits of organized society, the knowledge preservation through written records, the specialized skills development possible through role division, the security provided by collective resources. Her perspective had expanded to recognize validity in multiple approaches rather than contracting into rigid rejection of her former values. Integration rather than selection, she murmured to herself, a phrase Daniel often used when discussing medicinal treatments that combined traditional methods with adaptations for changing circumstances. The concept applied equally well to her emerging identity, not choosing between irreconcilable opposites, but developing capacity to incorporate seemingly contradictory elements into coherent wholeness. Yet here she sat, legally resurrected, but fundamentally altered, unable to simply step back into her previous identity, yet unwilling to completely abandon its foundations. The path forward would require newfound courage, not the desperate survival instinct that had sustained her after the massacre, but the constructive bravery needed to forge identity beyond established categories. As she prepared for sleep in the unfamiliar bed, Eleanor reached a decision that crystallized her future direction. She would complete her business at Fort Sullivan tomorrow, then return to Daniel as planned. Together, they would prepare for the arrival of his band in their summer hunting grounds. She would meet his people, learn their ways more fully, while maintaining connection with her own background through correspondence with family and selective engagement with settler society. The practical implementation of this decision formed in her mind with increasing clarity. She would request formal documentation from Colonel Harrison confirming her legal status, papers that would protect her from well-meaning rescue attempts by settlers or officials who might otherwise view her presence among native people as evidence of captivity rather than choice. She would establish communication channels through the fort's postal service, creating regular correspondence with her family that would gradually bridge the chasm between their understanding and her reality. Through these letters, she might eventually prepare them for potential reunion under circumstances that would honor her transformed identity rather than attempt to erase it. Most significantly, she would leverage her educational background to create purpose that transcended cultural boundaries. The Pawnee, like many native peoples, recognized the necessity of selective adaptation in a changing world, where territorial encroachment had become an inevitable reality. Children of Daniel's band would need understanding of English, mathematics, and settler customs to navigate increasingly complex interactions with expanding American presence. I could teach again, she realized, the thought bringing unexpected emotion, not as the rigid schoolmistress insisting on proper civilization of savage minds, the role frontier schools typically expected, but as a bridge figure offering tools for cultural navigation while respecting and preserving essential traditional knowledge. This potential role would require delicate balance, gaining acceptance from Daniel's people, while avoiding the appearance of imposing outsider values, providing genuinely useful skills without undermining traditional practices, presenting herself to occasional military or agency visitors as conducting civilizing education while actually facilitating cultural preservation through strategic adaptation. The complexity of this path would demand constant navigation of contradictions and careful management of different audiences' perceptions. Yet this very challenge resonated with Eleanor's emerging understanding of herself as someone capable of inhabiting apparent paradox, simultaneously honoring multiple truths without requiring them to be reconciled into simplistic unity. Neither fully returning to her previous world nor completely adopting Daniel's culture, she would instead create something unique, a bridge identity that honored both traditions while transcending their limitations. This path would face resistance from multiple directions, misunderstanding from those invested in rigid categorization, and practical challenges in implementation. Yet for the first time since watching her world burn around her 4 years earlier, Eleanor felt something beyond mere determination to survive or capacity to heal. She experienced genuine anticipation for future possibilities, not naive optimism that ignored difficulties ahead, but grounded hope built on hard-won understanding of her own resilience and the transformative potential of unexpected connection. The frightened woman who had hidden beneath a wagon while her world was destroyed could never have imagined this outcome. The ghost-like figure who had haunted the prairie would not have believed healing possible. Even the traumatized survivor who had reluctantly accepted shelter during a blizzard could not have envisioned a purposeful future beyond mere existence. Tomorrow, Eleanor would return to Daniel not as someone rescued, nor as someone fully healed, but as someone consciously choosing a path forward that honored all she had endured and all she had become. The decision itself represented transformation more profound than mere survival. It marked reclamation of agency, purpose, and the capacity to create meaning from circumstances that had once seemed only destructive. Outside the fort walls, beneath the same stars visible from the military compound, Daniel waited patiently at their rendezvous location, trusting both Eleanor's capability to navigate this challenge and his own commitment to remain present, regardless of her ultimate decision. Their paths had crossed against all probability, creating possibility neither could have anticipated alone. Whatever tomorrow brought, the transformation had already occurred. Eleanor Mason was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had found, not just in the unlikely sanctuary of a medicine man's lodge, but in the uncharted territory of her own resilient spirit. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to something Daniel had told her during their earliest conversations, when she was still more ghost than woman. He had explained that in Pawnee understanding, the most powerful healing plants were often those that survived in boundary zones, places where prairie met forest, where water encountered land, where mountains descended to valleys. These transition spaces, neither one environment nor another, but containing elements of both, produced medicines with unique properties unavailable in more homogeneous regions. The greatest strength often emerges from standing between worlds, he had observed, drawing nourishment from multiple sources rather than a single route. At the time, she had barely comprehended his meaning, still trapped in the either-or thinking of her former education. Now, on the threshold of consciously choosing a boundary existence, Eleanor recognized the profound wisdom in this perspective. Her future path would not be easier than conventional alternatives, quite the opposite. It would demand constant adaptation, careful navigation, and courage to withstand disapproval from those committed to clear, categorical boundaries. Yet this challenging path also promised a uniquely valuable perspective, the capacity to translate across divides, to recognize parallel truths in seemingly contradictory traditions, to build understanding where historical patterns had created only conflict. From the deepest wound of her life, the violent severing of her place in the ordered world, had emerged a possibility for contribution she could never have imagined in her previous existence. This realization brought neither triumphant certainty nor simplistic closure to her journey. The nightmares would continue, the grief would resurface, the path ahead would contain failures alongside successes. Transformation didn't erase trauma, but rather incorporated it into a new identity that contained both wounding and healing, both loss and discovery. Eleanor drifted toward sleep with a phrase from her teaching days echoing in her mind, words from Emerson she had once recited to students without fully comprehending their depth. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. The frontier had taught her the truth of these words in ways no formal education could have conveyed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she would meet them as neither the naive schoolteacher who had journeyed westward filled with civilizing certainty, nor the feral ghost who had haunted the prairie in traumatized isolation, but as someone who had earned the wisdom to recognize value and limitation in all perspectives, including her own. Morning at Fort Sullivan arrived with military precision. Bugle calls marking time. Soldiers performing drills in the central yard, supply wagons delivering provisions through the main gate. Eleanor woke to this orchestrated activity, feeling remarkably clear-headed after her night surrounded by the trappings of civilization. After a simple breakfast provided by the fort's kitchen, she completed the remaining official business with Lieutenant Collins, signing additional affidavits, receiving copies of documents that formally restored her legal status among the living, and arranging for her correspondence to be included in the next official mail dispatch eastward. Colonel Harrison asked me to provide this as well, Collins explained, handing her a folded document bearing the fort's official seal. It's a letter of passage explaining your circumstances and confirming your status as a civilian acting under your own authority rather than duress. Eleanor accepted the paper with genuine appreciation. Harrison had anticipated potential complications she might face and provided practical protection without explicitly endorsing her unconventional choices. A diplomatic solution that respected her autonomy while maintaining official neutrality. "Please convey my gratitude to the Colonel," she requested. "His handling of this matter shows remarkable understanding of complex circumstances." Collins nodded, then hesitated before adding, "Ma'am, if I might speak frankly, many at this fort remember the search party sent out after your wagon train was discovered. Finding no survivors was difficult for those involved. Your reappearance brings a measure of, well, redemption, I suppose, even under unusual circumstances. This unexpected perspective, that her survival might hold meaning beyond her personal journey, touched Eleanor deeply. She had thought only of what the massacre had taken from her, not how its aftermath had affected others who encountered its devastating evidence. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she replied softly. "Sometimes we forget that ripples extend far beyond the stone's initial impact." By mid-morning, Eleanor had concluded her business at Fort Sullivan. With her newly acquired documentation secured in her modest pack, she bid farewell to the military outpost that had simultaneously represented intrusive authority and practical protection in her complex circumstances. The journey back to the rendezvous point where Daniel awaited progressed smoothly. Eleanor moved with confident purpose, her posture noticeably different from the woman who had approached the fort the previous day. The official recognition of her survival, rather than constraining her future options, had paradoxically expanded her sense of possibility by removing the legal limbo that might have complicated her chosen path. Daniel was exactly where he had promised to be, sitting calmly beneath a spreading oak that provided shade against the strengthening spring sun. He rose as she approached, his expression revealing subtle relief at her return, despite his outward composure. "You found what you sought?" he asked once she reached him. Eleanor nodded, patting her pack where the documents rested. "Official resurrection," she replied with a hint of irony. "I exist again in their records and ledgers, and in your own understanding." Daniel's question penetrated beyond bureaucratic technicalities to the deeper implications of her fort visit. "That's more complicated," Eleanor acknowledged as they began walking together, leaving the fort gradually behind them. "Being there, surrounded by all the structures and systems I once took for granted, made me realize how profoundly my perspective has shifted. I recognized value in things I'd previously dismissed, and limitations in what I once considered unquestionable progress." "The boundary walker sees with different eyes," Daniel observed. "Exactly," she agreed, "and I've decided to continue walking that boundary." As they traveled through the afternoon, Eleanor shared her emerging vision for the future, her plan to establish connection with Daniel's band while maintaining selective engagement with settler society. Her hope to create educational exchange that respected both cultures rather than assuming superiority of either. Her intention to build communication with her family that might eventually foster understanding across seemingly insurmountable differences. Daniel listened attentively, occasionally offering practical insights about potential challenges or considerations she might not have anticipated. His response neither discouraged her ambitions nor romanticized their implementation, instead providing grounded perspective that acknowledged both possibility and limitation. "My people will judge by actions, not intentions," he explained as they discussed her potential reception among his band. "Words matter less than consistent presence and demonstrated respect. Some will welcome new knowledge, others will fear its influence. Your patience will be tested many times before trust is established. I expect no less, Eleanor replied. Any community guards itself against perceived threats to its foundations. I saw the same resistance in Clearwater Creek when I attempted to introduce educational methods that challenged established patterns. This equitable comparison, recognizing similar human reactions across cultural differences rather than attributing resistance solely to primitive thinking, demonstrated Eleanor's evolving perspective. She had begun developing the capacity to analyze patterns without hierarchical judgment, identifying parallel processes rather than assuming fundamental differences between civilized and savage responses. As evening approached, they established camp in a protected hollow beneath a rocky outcropping. The familiar routine of their shared tasks, gathering firewood, preparing food, creating basic shelter, had acquired deeper significance in light of Eleanor's decision. These weren't merely survival activities, but deliberate choices, reflecting her commitment to a path that integrated rather than selected between available options. After their meal, seated beside the small fire, Eleanor broached the question that would determine immediate next steps. When will your band arrive at the summer hunting grounds? Within a moon cycle, Daniel replied. They follow the buffalo migration north, camping along established routes from winter territory. Their messengers have already visited my lodge, site to confirm my presence for important healing ceremonies. And this arrival, will it allow gradual introduction, or must I be presented formally from the beginning? Daniel considered carefully before responding. Walking Bear, our band's leader, values traditional protocols, but also recognizes changing circumstances require adaptation. A respectful introduction that acknowledges your unique position would be appropriate, neither claiming traditional belonging nor apologizing for your presence. Eleanor nodded, mentally preparing for this crucial first impression. I should contribute something meaningful, she observed, not attempting to purchase acceptance, but demonstrating genuine intention, to offer value rather than simply extract benefit. Your understanding already exceeds most who cross cultural boundaries, Daniel noted with approval. Their discussion extended into practical preparations, appropriate clothing that would show respect without inappropriate appropriation, basic language phrases that would demonstrate effort rather than assumption of accommodation, specific customs whose observance would signal genuine interest in cultural understanding rather than tourist curiosity. Throughout this planning, Eleanor recognized that her approach differed fundamentally from conventional civilizing missions. She sought not to change Daniel's people, but to create space where mutual exchange could occur, with dignity intact on both sides. This perspective, neither romanticizing native culture nor assuming its inevitable disappearance, represented a third path rarely acknowledged in the dominant narratives of her time. The following morning brought them closer to the winter lodge where their journey had begun months earlier. The landscape had transformed dramatically since Eleanor's initial arrival. Snow replaced by vibrant spring growth, frozen streams now flowing freely, dormant plants emerging with renewed vitality. Nature itself offered a visual metaphor for Eleanor's personal transformation from frozen isolation to reawakened engagement. As they approached the final ridge overlooking the lodge site, Daniel paused, gesturing toward the horizon where distant hills rolled toward lands rarely traveled by settlers. My people's summer hunting grounds lie there, he explained, 3 days' journey beyond those hills. The valley holds a particular meaning. Traditional stories say it was created when Star Woman fell from the sky and landed between mountains, forming a perfect basin where buffalo found sanctuary during ancient winter. The significance of his sharing this cultural knowledge, sacred origins not typically revealed to outsiders, wasn't lost on Eleanor. It represented trust developing between them, willingness to risk genuine exchange rather than maintaining protective separation. Thank you, she said simply, understanding that elaborate expressions of gratitude would diminish rather than enhance the moment's meaning. Their return to the Earth Lodge brought mixed emotions for Eleanor. The structure that had sheltered her, healing now represented a transition point rather than destination, a temporary sanctuary between phases of journey rather than permanent residence. The coming weeks would involve preparation for departure, organization of acquired knowledge, development of resources needed for the next challenging stage. That evening, as they settled into familiar routines within the lodge, Eleanor made a symbolic gesture that acknowledged both her decision and its implications. From her modest possessions, she removed the gold wedding band she had continued wearing throughout her ordeal and subsequent recovery. The simple circle of metal had remained her final connection to unbroken identity when all else disappeared. With deliberate movements, she placed the ring in a small pouch, crafted from materials Daniel had taught her to prepare, adding a lock of her hair and a fragment of paper containing her written name. Following ceremonial practices she had observed during their months together, she sealed this bundle with sinew thread and placed it carefully beside the central fire. Daniel watched without comment, recognizing the personal significance of her actions without requiring explanation. When she had finished, he added several dried herbs to the fire, creating fragrant smoke that filled the lodge with cleansing aroma. "A threshold crossed deserves acknowledgement," he observed quietly. Eleanor nodded, finding unexpected emotional release in this improvised ritual that neither rejected her past nor remained captive to it. The ring represented not just her marriage to Michael, but her former identity, constructed around clear social categories and established expectations. By ceremonially setting it aside without discarding it entirely, she honored what had been while creating space for what might become. "I thought healing meant recovering who I was before the attack," she reflected. "Now I understand it means becoming someone who incorporates that experience rather than erasing or being defined by it. The strongest healing creates new wholeness." Daniel agreed, not returning to what existed before wounding. This principle, transformation rather than restoration, had gradually become the foundation for Eleanor's emerging identity. She would never again be the confident schoolteacher who had embarked westward filled with civilizing certainty, nor remain the feral ghost haunting prairie margins in traumatized isolation. Instead, she was becoming someone who contained elements of both while transcending their limitations through integration of seemingly contradictory truths. The path ahead presented formidable challenges. Daniel's people might reject her despite her sincere intentions. Settler society would certainly condemn her choices when they became widely known. Her own family might struggle to comprehend decisions that violated every conventional expectation for a woman of her background and education. Even practical survival would demand constant adaptation and learning beyond anything her previous life had required. Yet facing these challenges from the perspective of conscious choice rather than desperate reaction represented profound transformation. From the broken woman who had wandered the prairie as living ghost, the future remains uncertain, its potential outcomes impossible to predict with confidence. But Eleanor approached this uncertainty with capacity for engagement rather than retreat, for creation rather than mere endurance. As nightfall deepened around their lodge, Eleanor recognized that her journey had not concluded, but rather begun anew with expanded awareness. The massacre that had destroyed her former life had initiated a process that stripped away every artificial certainty, forcing encounters with fundamental questions about what constituted meaningful existence beyond societal frameworks that typically defined acceptable answers. Through unlikely connections across cultural boundaries traditionally maintained, through mutual suspicion, she had discovered the possibility for healing that honored rather than erased profound suffering. Daniel's medicinal wisdom, operating from entirely different premises than conventional medical approaches, had facilitated not merely physical survival, but psychological integration that standard treatments could never have accomplished. Most significantly, Eleanor had reclaimed agency, not by returning to familiar patterns, but by consciously creating alternative paths that drew wisdom from multiple traditions while remaining captive to none. The boundary existence she now embraced, neither fully inhabiting settler society nor completely adopting native perspective, offered a unique vantage point from which to recognize parallel truths across apparent divisions. As she prepared for sleep that night, Eleanor felt neither triumphant certainty nor anxious doubt about her chosen direction. Instead, she experienced grounded acceptance of both possibility and limitation inherent in boundary existence, the challenges it would inevitably present alongside opportunities it uniquely offered. The prairie ghost who had haunted these lands for years, neither fully dead nor truly living, had finally found a path toward authentic presence that honored all she had endured and all she might yet become. Through an unexpected connection with wisdom from tradition entirely different from her own, Eleanor Mason had discovered that healing's deepest power lay not in restoring what was lost, but in transforming wound into window through which entirely new landscape became visible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.